November was my absolute worst reading month of the entire 2022, and as a result, after boldly declaring that I don't do TBRs, for December, I'm doing one. If you watched my last two reading vlogs, you would have noticed that I complained repeatedly about the density of my schedule. So much so that you might have assumed that complaining is all I do, and not entirely without reason either. So let's go again. In November alone, I had to organize a team building event abroad on a very steep deadline, whilst my other work responsibilities were not only not diminished, but actually increased in a lot of ways. Personal life was quite busy as well, and I could barely find time to read for 15 consecutive minutes, if that. Not to mention that I suffer from a slight flight phobia, so I spent the days leading to both of my flights and the flights themselves wallowing in dread and stress. So given all of that, it came as no surprise that November was my absolute worst reading month of the entire 2022 in nearly every aspect. I was able to read 4 books, 2 fantasies, 1 historical fiction, and 1 manga, which amounted to only about 1,500 pages, which is less than a third of the pages that I read in October and slightly less than what I read last year. Pretty weak, as you can see, but considering how much I was able to accomplish in the other aspects of my life, I am not too devastated. In addition, everything I read I enjoyed, and I suppose that's all that matters. So let's look at the books in the order in which I read them. First is Mort by Terry Pratchett. I would classify this as a classic adult sci fantasy comedy. It's the first in the Death series and the 4th in the Discworld series. The story unfolds on the Discworld and follows several very interesting characters, among which are young Mortimer, or Mort, whom everybody calls Boy, Death himself, his adopted daughter, a princess, and a magician of a very lacking skill. After being selected to be Death's apprentice, Mort manages to get himself into a ton of trouble trying to balance the responsibilities that come with such great power and the trepidations of a young heart. The book is hilarious and takes us to a bunch of curious places where we meet a bunch of even more curious characters. This is the first book I read in the Discworld after being recommended as a great starting point, and though I am still new to the world, I tend to agree with that sentiment. I quite enjoyed it, though as it happens to be with a lot of the classic fantasies, I somewhat struggled to understand the characters' motivations at times. So I gave it 4 stars, and I will continue with the series probably sometime soon. Next we have The Shadow of the Wind by Carlos Ruiz Zafón. This is an adult historical fiction with elements of mystery and magical realism, and is the first book in the Cemetery of Forgotten Books series. It's situated in Barcelona in 1945 and follows young Daniel, whose father is a bookseller, and one day takes him to the Cemetery of Forgotten Books to pick a book to cherish and take care of. Daniel chooses The Shadow of the Wind by a very unknown author by the name of Julián Carax. Daniel reads the book within a night and becomes fascinated with it and starts looking for other books by the author Julián Carax, only to find out that somebody is going around trying to destroy every book ever written by this author. We follow the boy as he stubbornly gets himself into trouble and adventure, as he succeeds and fails, and as he makes friends and enemies, and slowly unfolds the story of Julián Carax. The book is quite atmospheric and vivid, as well as way darker than I initially expected, and I am not easily made to clutch my pearls. I mentioned my thoughts about this book in detail in my last reading vlog over here, so if you're interested, go give it a look. Overall, I quite enjoyed it, despite the fact that it took me almost a month to complete it. I gave it 4 stars and will continue with the series. Book number 3 was The Lost Metal by Brandon Sanderson. This is an adult high fantasy and the 4th and last book in the second era of Mistborn. It's book 7 in Mistborn overall. I read it as an ebook because my pre-order of the physical copy still hasn't arrived, which is really frustrating. The book came out on the 15th of November and I picked it up almost immediately, which isn't very usual for me. I prefer to predominantly read backlisted titles for some reason. The second era of Mistborn as a whole follows mainly Wax and Wayne, which are lawmen in the basin of Elendel. I won't mention much about the setting and plot because this is the last book in a series which follows another series, and I wouldn't want to spoil you about anything. If you would like to see my immediate thoughts about the book upon reading it, you can check my last 2 reading vlogs because I mentioned it there heavily. To summarize my thoughts here, this book, as well as the entire second era of the Mistborn series, is quite fast-paced and often reads like an action buddy cop series. It's full of action, mystery, comedic relief, and hints, as well as outright spoilers for the rest of the Cosmere. So if you're planning on reading this, please make sure you've read pretty much everything else in the Cosmere that has been published prior to it, including some of the short stories. To be more specific, before you pick Mistborn Era 2, make sure that you've read Mistborn Era 1, obviously, Stormlight Archive, at least up to and including Oathbringer, Elantris, Warbreaker, Emperor's Soul, Dawnshard, and Mistborn Secret History. This will ensure that you not only get all the references here, but also that you're not spoiled for anything else about the Cosmere and get to enjoy its enveloping fully. I have only one criticism about this book and the entire Mistborn Era too, actually, and that is that the character development is severely lacking as opposed to other Brandon Sanderson's works. And that is not to say that the characters here were uninteresting, on the contrary, they had great potential. But we didn't really get the opportunity to get to know them. The focus was on action to such an extent that every attempt at character development was kind of cut short. I felt like I was getting the abridged version of every single character in this book, the cliff notes of their personality. And look, I can see how that can be appealing to people who prefer plot and action to emotional investment. I am sadly not one of those people, and I barely cared at the tragic moments because I barely knew any of these characters. Still, the book has many great qualities, and it was a suitable ending to the series, for now. I gave it 4 stars, and I'm looking forward to Era 3. And the fourth and last book I was able to pick up in November was Full Metal Alchemist Volume 5 by Hiromu Arakawa. This is a young adult/adult manga series about 2 brothers who attempt to bring their mother back from the dead using alchemy unsuccessfully, and in the process one of them loses an arm and a leg, and the other his entire body. So now we follow them while they travel the world looking for ways to restore their bodies. This series is my first foray into manga, and I am loving it. I watched part of the animated series years ago, and I don't remember why I stopped watching it because I remember enjoying it quite a lot. The action, the mystery, and the world building in this series is amazing. Not to mention the many lovable and hateable characters. I gave this one 5 stars like every other one I've read in this series so far, and I wanted to pick up the next one so badly because this one ended on a bit of a cliffhanger. Unfortunately, I don't own volume 6, so now I have to wait until I get it to continue. Now, this concludes our wrap-up for November, but we're not done yet because I have to backtrack on something. I have mentioned repeatedly that I don't do TBRs because I have a very hard time sticking to them. The claustrophobic nature of having to stick to a specific number of predetermined books leaves me more anxious than eager to read, so I generally avoid it. However, I am a goal-oriented person and I like to know what I'm working with whenever I'm on a tight schedule. And since the end of the year is rapidly approaching, I would like to be able to achieve 2 goals before that happens. Goal number 1 is to read a total of 100 books in 2022. This is my Goodreads goal, and I am 11 books away from it as of filming this video. That's not a lot, but I am already 3 books behind schedule, and I have to factor in personal life and work, especially around the holidays. Now, I could easily pick 11 tiny books and be done with it in no time, but here comes goal number 2. And that is to read all the books on my books I want to read before the end of the year list, which you can see me talk about right here. Looking at that list, we can see that I have already completed 4 out of the 10 books, so we have 6 remaining, and 4 out of those 6 are over 600 pages. So the total pages of all of these is 3,795, which is not strictly unachievable, but those are only 6 books out of 11. Additionally, I already started 2 books in December, and adding these to the page count, we end up with 5,026 total pages, and I will still have to read 3 more books to achieve goal 1. Another issue is that I'm buddy reading some of those series with a friend of mine, and even if by some miracle I manage to fit these into my schedule, I don't think she will be able to. As you can see, I have gotten myself into a pretty tight spot. I would have to read well over 5,000 pages, split between 11 books, 6 of which are some of the hardest hitting high fantasies out there, and all that within a month. All the while working full-time, spending time with family and loved ones, and taking care of 2 cat-shaped demons. So can I do it? Hell no. Not without shoving myself face first into a massive reading slump. I could maybe if I cut communication with everyone and took a month off of work. And while sometimes I dream about this scenario, reading doesn't pay my bills, nor does it replace human contact, no matter how much I prefer it sometimes. So what do? Well, after a long, detailed deliberation of like 10 minutes, I decided to prioritize and focus on goal 1, as it is the more achievable of the 2 goals. And since I don't want to fully give up on goal 2, it's better to achieve half of it than not achieve it at all, I decided to focus on the books from it that aren't already tied up in buddy reads, which will reduce the list significantly and gives me some more flexibility. Then I have some books that I intended to read in November but had to drop because of, well, lack of time. So I will also add these to the list. And of course, the books that I already started in December. So that leaves me with the TBR for December as follows. First, Running Blind by Lee Child. This is an adult thriller and the fourth book in the Jack Reacher series. I'm reading it as an ebook because it was impossible to find it physically anywhere around here. I already started reading this book on the 1st of December, I believe. We are reading it with my friend as a buddy read, and I'm immensely enjoying it. I'm already something like 60% into it, and so far I think it's my favorite from the series. We'll see how it's gonna unfold later on and what the conclusion will be, but I am immensely enjoying it. If you haven't read the Jack Reacher series and you enjoy your classic thriller, big strong guy chasing bad guys, I think you're gonna enjoy this very much. And then we have the other book I've already started in December, and that is Fire and Blood by George R.R. Martin. This is an adult high fantasy written like a history book. It is set in the world of ice and fire and follows the history of the Targaryen family, their rise and fall within Westeros, basically. I am something like 40% into it. I started it on a whim. I had absolutely no plans of reading it, but one day I saw it and I was like, I just want to, open it and read a little bit, and then it grabbed me and I continued reading it. I am very much enjoying it. A lot of the stories that are told here I already knew from the world of Ice and Fire, but they are elaborated quite a lot and I'm having a good time. It also has quite nice artwork every now and then. So yeah, it is quite big. It is over 700 pages, but as I already mentioned, I'm something like 40% into it, maybe 45, and I'm hopeful that I'll be able to finish it during next week. Now, from the books that are on my books I would like to read before the end of the year list, I have two that aren't tied in buddy reads, the first of which is Jade City by Fonda Lee. This is an adult fantasy, kind of like urban fantasy. It's the first book in the Greenbone saga, and it's often been compared to The Godfather, which I haven't watched. Don't judge me, I don't watch movies. I've heard great things about it from people who I trust, so I'm looking forward to reading it. I've been planning on picking it up way earlier, but there was never time, so now I hope I'll be able to do this during December. And then the other book on that list that's not tied into a buddy read is The Name of the Wind by Patrick Rothfuss. This is an adult high fantasy and the first book in the Kingkiller Chronicles, which is very famous for many reasons. I have started this book a while ago, maybe like a year ago or so, and I read something like 30%, and then I had to stop for, I don't remember what reason. Something came up and I had to drop reading for a bit. And I remember what I read, I very much enjoyed. The book is famous for its very lyrical and beautiful writing style, and I tend to agree. It is not too much, it is descriptive, but it brings more atmosphere than anything else. It has great mysteries and world building, and I'm very much looking forward to it. Now, there are some controversies linked to this series, and if you'd like to hear me talk about it more, you can watch my video of the books I want to read before the end of the year list. I elaborate on the topic in that video. And then for the books that I intended to read in November but didn't have the time to, we have The Girl in the Stars by Mark Lawrence. This is an adult fantasy and the first book in the Book of Ice series, which is a sequel to the Book of the Ancestors series, which I read a few years ago and immensely enjoyed. The series is set in the same world but kind of more on the ice rather than in the more civilized cities. I started reading it in the beginning of November, kind of on a whim. On my way to the gym, I wanted to listen to an audiobook and I picked this one and I enjoyed it quite a lot. Unfortunately, I don't retain information so well when I listen to audiobooks. I also cannot properly visualize what I'm reading when I'm listening to it for some reason. So I dropped it as an audiobook, and despite how much I enjoyed it, unfortunately, I didn't have the time to read it physically. So now I'm hopeful that I'll be able to do so in December. And then the other book I intended to read in November but couldn't is Beckoning of the Gate by Benjamin J. Ryan. This is a young adult fantasy that I don't know pretty much anything about. I read the synopsis once and liked it, but then it flew out of my head, which is a very common occurrence with me these days. But I love the cover, and the author contacted me on Instagram asking me if I would like to read the book and review it. And of course, I would like to support an author, and agreed. Unfortunately, because things were so busy and I had other priorities, I couldn't do that in November, and I'm hopeful to be able to do that in December. Actually, that's why I'm putting it on my TBR, because I would like to make the commitment to do so. Now, this makes a total of 6 books that are gonna be a must to be read in December. On top of that, based on mood, I will add at least 5 more books to make a total of 11. This way, I have both strict and somewhat loose TBR, and I managed to accomplish goal 1 while making some progress on goal 2, somewhere a little bit over 50%. To be honest, I already feel somewhat demotivated looking at this list. But you know how life is, we set up goals and we try to achieve them doing our best, and if we succeed, that's great, and if we don't, we at least have made some progress hopefully, and we still have next year to try again. So stay tuned for my summary of this potential fiasco, and if you'd like to see my wrap up for October, check out this video. Bye!